They say the woods don't keep secrets, only bury them deep enough that most people stop digging. But on the far edge of Briar County, where the Appalachian fog hangs low and the trees seem to whisper among themselves, there was one secret the town wished more than anything to forget. It began with a single rust-eaten report about a missing girl, a form yellowed by time, creased as though someone's hands had trembled while filling it out. The name on the document didn't ring bells to most people anymore, but the location did, the old Calder Trail. A place everyone avoided unless they had no choice. A place tied to a family no one wanted to talk about. The deputy reading the file had heard only murmurs, half-truths muttered over bar counters, warnings spoken in voices so low they dissolved before reaching the air. There had been a man once, a patriarch who vanished into the woods with his children after being accused of unspeakable acts. Some claimed he died there. Others said he never left. But the truth, if there was one, lay somewhere beyond the thick tree line where daylight struggled to enter and where the silence felt almost alive. On the evening the investigation began, the sky dimmed earlier than usual, smothered by storm clouds that refused to move. The deputy stood before the narrow forest path, its entrance nearly swallowed by vines and roots curling like claws across the ground. His radio buzzed with static, as if something in the woods interfered with the signal. The deeper he stepped, the more the world behind him seemed to recede until even the faint hum of civilization disappeared. Only the crunch of damp leaves followed him, echoing strangely, as if someone else were walking just a step behind. Then, from between the trees, he saw her. A girl, barefoot, trembling, her eyes wide with a fear so raw it made the deputy's breath hitch. Dirt streaked her face, and her hair hung in tangled sheets. She whispered something that froze the air between them. She called him sir, then asked if he'd seen her father. But the next words drained what little warmth remained in the forest. My father, my husband, his coming. Before the deputy could respond, she vanished into the underbrush with an abruptness that felt impossible, leaving nothing but a fading echo and the growing realization that the forgotten legends might not have been legends at all. And as he stood alone in the darkening woods, a cold certainty crept over him. This was not just a missing person's case. This was an inheritance of horror, one that had lived, bred, and thrived where no one dared to look. The missing girl report began like any other, standard forms, routine questions, blank spaces waiting to be filled by someone desperate for answers, but something about it felt disturbingly out of place from the moment it reached the sheriff's desk. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, almost frantic, as though the person who filled it out could barely hold the pen. The signature belonged to a distant relative, not a parent, which immediately raised suspicion. She claimed she hadn't seen the girl in weeks and that the child's immediate family lived somewhere near the dense Appalachian woods where no phone lines reached and no one from town ever ventured willingly. The deputy assigned to the case sensed an unusual tension in the room when he first mentioned the location. Glances were exchanged, conversations stilled, and someone muttered that the trail should have been closed off years ago. No one wanted to explain why. As the deputy dug into the sparse details, he discovered something strange. This wasn't the first time someone connected to that old family had disappeared without a trace. Records from decades earlier revealed similar cases, children reported missing, investigations started but abruptly halted, and notes scribbled in margins suggesting family interference or lack of cooperation. Each report became progressively more vague, as if the deeper the authorities looked, the less they wanted to know. Eventually the trail of paperwork stopped altogether, as though the entire family had evaporated into the woods. The current report described the missing girl as quiet, withdrawn, and rarely seen outside the boundary of the forest. Neighbors, if they could be called that, said she sometimes appeared at the edge of the trees, watching silently before slipping back into the shadows. The relative who filed the report admitted she hadn't spoken to the girl in nearly a year but insisted that something felt wrong, that the woods seemed different lately, heavier somehow. She claimed she woke one night to distant screams carried on the wind, sounds she tried to convince herself belonged to an animal, yet the fear in her voice suggested she didn't believe that. What troubled the deputy most wasn't the report itself but the collective reaction of the townspeople. Every question he asked was met with hesitation or outright avoidance, as if he were probing a wound everyone had learned to leave untouched. An older man finally pulled him aside and whispered that the family living in those woods wasn't like others, that they kept to themselves for a reason, and that searching for the missing girl meant stepping into a legacy of darkness the town had tried for generations to forget. The whispered legend drifted through Briar County like a cold draft that slipped under doors, never fully acknowledged yet always present, shaping the way people spoke about the woods and those who once lived there. It was never told outright, never shared with confidence or clarity. Instead, it survived through fragments muttered at bar counters, half-finished warnings exchanged on front porches, and stories cut short the moment a child leaned too close. No one wanted to be responsible for keeping the tale alive, yet no one dared let it die either. It began generations earlier with a man whose name town records barely preserved, a patriarch known for his fierce isolation and disturbing beliefs about purity, legacy, and blood. He built a homestead deep in the forest, farther than any horse trail would comfortably reach, ensuring no outsiders would wander near. Over time, people realized he wasn't just preserving privacy, he was building a world where only his rules mattered, a world where outsiders were seen as threats rather than neighbors. The legend claimed that he refused to let his lineage mix with the outside world, that he believed the future of his bloodline depended on remaining untouched. The whispers suggested that he married within his own family, forcing his children into roles they never chose, binding them to traditions he insisted were sacred. Some versions of the tale insisted that he referred to his eldest daughter as his wife, others hinted he repeated the same cycle with each generation, passing down his rules like scripture. Those who lived nearest the woods reported hearing strange noises at night, shouts, crying, and something that sounded like chanting carried through the trees, making people bolt their doors even when they weren't sure what they were afraid of. As the years passed and the family withdrew deeper into isolation, sightings became rare but unforgettable. Hunters sometimes claimed they spotted figures moving just beyond their lantern light, pale and silent, watching with wide, unblinking eyes before vanishing between the trunks. Others insisted they once saw children with oddly familiar features, all resembling the same stern patriarch as though the line had folded in on itself. The stories always ended the same way, with someone warning never to venture too far into the woods, never to follow any footprints leading inward, never to answer if a voice called your name from behind the trees. By the time the missing girl report surfaced, the legend had aged into something brittle yet potent, a tale no one admitted believing yet everyone feared. For the deputy, hearing these fractured accounts created a chilling sense that the line between superstition and reality might be thinner than he imagined, because the way people trembled while recounting the story made it clear that whatever had happened in those woods had left a stain the town could never fully scrub away. The discovery of the abandoned path was the first tangible proof that the whispers about the forest were more than stories meant to scare children. The deputy had spent hours navigating the edge of the woods, pushing through brambles and leaning over fallen logs, guided by vague directions from locals who seemed both eager and reluctant to point the way. It was a hidden trail, barely noticeable to anyone not looking for it, its entrance masked by overgrown vines and twisted roots that curled across the earth like gnarled fingers. The air felt different there, heavier, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy, leaving the ground in a perpetual twilight that made every shadow seem alive. Each step taken along the narrow dirt track made a faint crunch that echoed strangely, amplifying the sense that the woods were watching, waiting, aware of intruders. The deputy paused often, scanning the dense underbrush, feeling a subtle unease settle in the pit of his stomach, a warning that he was crossing into territory that had long been abandoned by reason and embraced by something else entirely. As he followed the trail deeper, he noticed remnants of a life that had been carefully concealed from outsiders. Shattered glass from old lanterns glinted under layers of moss, and rusted nails protruded from timbers scattered across the path. The air carried a faint, lingering odor of smoke, decayed wood, and something more elusive, something metallic and sweet, difficult to identify but impossible to ignore. Each fragment suggested habitation, yet nothing moved. The buildings that eventually appeared were half hidden by the overgrowth, their outlines distorted by years of neglect. A crumbling fence ran alongside one side of the trail, warped and splintered as if time itself had tried to erase it, and the homestead beyond looked like a relic frozen in a different century, untouched by modernization and deliberately cut off from the world beyond the forest. Windows were dark, some shattered, others caked with grime, and the roof sagged as though weighted by decades of isolation. The deputy could almost hear the ghosts of everyday life, the echo of footsteps, the scrape of furniture, the whispered voices of children long grown into silence. As he moved closer, the path seemed to narrow, forcing him to squeeze between trees that leaned unnaturally, their trunks knotting into shapes that mimicked human forms. Every so often, he caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, small and fleeting, leaving him questioning whether it was a trick of light or something more deliberate, something alive. The deeper he went, the more certain he became that this path, hidden for generations, led not just to an abandoned homestead but to a world deliberately erased from the memory of the town. It was a threshold into a domain where rules were different, where fear had been cultivated and isolation had become absolute, and the deputy understood with a sinking certainty that crossing it meant entering a story that had been waiting decades to be found. The first encounter changed everything. After following the abandoned trail through the dense undergrowth, the deputy felt the oppressive stillness of the forest pressing in from all sides, each step muffled by layers of fallen leaves and soft earth. The further he went, the more the world he had left behind seemed to vanish, the distant hum of cars, the faint glow of houses, even the wind itself became muted, as though the forest had claimed its own atmosphere. Then, just as he rounded a cluster of ancient oaks, he saw her. At first, she appeared almost like a reflection, pale and fragile, standing motionless at the edge of a small clearing. Her hair, tangled and dark, hung around her face in uneven strands, partially obscuring wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to drink in everything around her while revealing nothing. Her clothing was torn and dirt-streaked, yet there was a strange, almost ceremonial neatness to her posture, as though she had been trained to hold herself a certain way, to remain visible without speaking. The deputy called her name, his voice cracking slightly in the heavy air, but she did not respond. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze fixated on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, in a whisper so soft he could barely hear it over the rustle of the leaves, she spoke words that twisted his stomach. She called a name, one he did not recognize, but immediately followed it with another, equally bewildering. "Daddy, husband, please, don't leave me." The combination of familial and marital terms in the same breath sent a chill down his spine. There was something wrong, profoundly wrong, about the way she spoke, as if her entire life had been molded by forces that made ordinary relationships unrecognizable. Before he could react, she darted sideways into the shadows of the underbrush, moving with a speed and silence that seemed unnatural for a girl her size. The deputy instinctively pursued her, but she vanished like a ghost between the trees, leaving only the faintest impression of movement and the sound of her shallow breathing echoing through the forest. In the clearing, he noticed subtle signs of life, footprints pressed into the damp soil, disturbed leaves where someone or something had passed moments before, and a faint glimmer of something metallic half-buried near a tree root. Each clue confirmed that she was real, that she was here, yet the forest seemed determined to keep her hidden, as if the earth itself conspired to obscure the truth. As he stood alone, the weight of the encounter settled over him, bringing a sudden awareness that this was no ordinary missing person case. The girl's existence, her strange words, and the unnatural ease with which she navigated the forest revealed a hidden world operating by rules the deputy could barely comprehend. The first glimpse of her was not just an introduction to a mystery, it was a warning, a sign that the dark legacy whispered about in the town's legends was alive, active, and dangerously close, waiting just beyond reach, ready to reveal horrors that had long been buried. The discovery of the journal beneath the floorboards was like uncovering a heartbeat frozen in time, a fragile link to generations of secrets no one had dared to confront. The deputy had stumbled upon it while inspecting the creaking floor of the dilapidated homestead, a section of wood so brittle it gave way with a careful prod, revealing a small cavity hidden in the shadowed corners of the room. Inside lay a bundle of leather-bound notebooks, yellowed with age, their edges frayed and spines cracked. The smell of decay and old ink rose from them, mingling with the forest's damp aroma, and the deputy hesitated, aware that these pages might contain truths that had been deliberately kept from the world. The handwriting was dense, cramped, and irregular, as though written under pressure, by hands that had grown both meticulous and anxious over the years. The first entries described mundane domestic life, feeding children, maintaining the homestead, marking the passage of seasons, but there was always an undercurrent of obsession, a sense of control imposed over every detail of existence. As the deputy read further, the journal revealed patterns that were increasingly disturbing. Each generation documented marriages, births, and daily routines, but these accounts were interspersed with instructions, rules, and admonitions from the patriarch. Children were recorded not as individuals but as heirs, as vessels for a bloodline that had to be preserved at any cost. The writing hinted at ceremonies, secretive practices, and coded language that suggested coercion and manipulation, as if the act of recording life itself was a ritual of compliance. One passage described a daughter referred to alternately as child, wife, and successor, the language jarring in its casual delivery, as though the writer had normalized what most would recognize as grotesque. The journal did not hide these arrangements in euphemisms, it treated them as duty, obligation, and sometimes even divine mandate, offering glimpses into a mindset that had warped normal affection into something controlling, obsessive, and utterly isolating. What unsettled the deputy most was the repetition across entries spanning decades. Each generation recounted the same cycles: children marrying within the family, obedience enforced, choices erased, and outsiders kept at bay. References to family duty and preserving the line recurred with a chilling consistency, a pattern that made it clear this was not the behavior of a single man or a single family, but the continuation of a doctrine deliberately maintained. Marginal notes suggested anxiety, fear of outsiders discovering the truth, and occasional guilt, but even these emotions were tempered by the overriding concern for lineage. The cumulative effect of reading the journal was suffocating. The deputy could sense the weight of history pressing down, the invisible walls of control that had confined the family for generations, and the shadow of the patriarch still lingering in the corners of the abandoned home, watching, guiding, and ensuring that the cycle would continue. Each page turned was a step deeper into a legacy of obsession, a story written in ink and blood, waiting for someone to finally confront it. The revelation of the patriarch's true identity came like a sudden, cold gust through the deputy's mind, overturning every assumption he had made about the family hidden in the woods. For weeks, he had relied on fragmented accounts, whispered stories, and the sparse evidence scattered around the homestead, trying to piece together a lineage that seemed as twisted as the gnarled trees surrounding it. Records suggested that the current patriarch was the son of the original man who had vanished decades ago, a continuation of the same bloodline. Yet as the deputy sifted through census documents, birth certificates, and decades-old property deeds, inconsistencies began to emerge. Names didn't match, ages conflicted, and obituaries hinted at deaths that may never have occurred. The more he dug, the more the carefully constructed narrative of a single, isolated family began to unravel. Then, in a brittle envelope tucked behind a false panel in the homestead's wall, he found a letter dated nearly 50 years earlier. Its contents hinted at an accident, a fire reported to have killed one of the patriarch's sons, a son presumed dead and erased from public memory, only to resurface in the present as the very man controlling the family from the shadows. The deputy's mind raced as he pieced together the evidence. The patriarch had meticulously maintained a facade, manipulating records, ensuring that anyone who might question the lineage would encounter dead ends or vague explanations. The realization that the man commanding the family's twisted traditions had been thought dead for decades sent a shiver down his spine. It explained the town's reticence to speak openly about the family, the way rumors seemed simultaneously detailed and impossible to verify. If the patriarch had been living in secret for so long, he had been free to orchestrate his family's life without interference, shaping generations according to his own warped rules, all while the world assumed his bloodline had ended. The deputy began to understand that the horror he faced wasn't simply about incest or isolation, it was about a man who had effectively cheated death in the eyes of the law, who had re-emerged to exercise absolute control over his descendants, unchallenged and unseen. This discovery also shed light on the patriarch's methods. His knowledge of the outside world, though limited, was enough to manipulate anyone who came too close. By assuming the identity of a presumed dead family member, he created a myth of continuity, a sense of inevitability that bound the family to his will. Each generation followed the same rules, unaware that the figure guiding them was not merely a father but a shadow from the past, a ghost who had returned to maintain dominance. The deputy realized that he was confronting not just a family steeped in secrecy, but a man who had spent decades cultivating obedience, fear, and loyalty, a man whose very identity had been hidden in plain sight, waiting to strike terror into anyone daring enough to challenge the story the woods had been hiding. The locked cellar door was the kind of detail that made the deputy's pulse quicken in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had wandered through the creaking homestead for hours, exploring rooms thick with dust, peeling wallpaper, and the faint, lingering scent of decay, when he noticed the trapdoor tucked into the corner of the kitchen floor. It was small, square, and unremarkable at first glance, almost perfectly blending with the worn wooden planks around it. Yet there was something about the way the edges were slightly warped, the faint scuff marks around the latch, that suggested it had been used recently. The deputy knelt, brushing away layers of dirt and cobwebs, and tried the latch, only to find it firmly secured. A chill crawled up his spine as he realized that whatever lay beneath was intentionally hidden, kept out of sight for reasons no one wanted to explain. As he circled the trapdoor, he became aware of subtle sounds, almost imperceptible, emanating from below. At first, he thought it was the house settling, the old timbers groaning under the weight of decades. But then the noises became clearer, scratches, faint thumps, and even a muffled whimper. The deputy froze, straining to listen, and the sounds grew more desperate, like someone trying to communicate without being seen. Each noise carried an unmistakable urgency, a signal that someone or something was trapped, aware of his presence but restrained from revealing itself fully. The realization hit him like a hammer. There were children hidden beneath this house, children who had been kept away from the world for reasons that could only be sinister. The idea of inbreeding, of control, and of ritualized obedience that had surfaced in the journal now took on a terrifying immediacy. The cellar was not simply a storage space, it was a prison. The children here had likely been born into confinement, their lives measured by the patriarch's obsessive need for secrecy and continuity. The deputy imagined the layout, a dark, damp enclosure, air thick and heavy, the faint light of a candle or lantern revealing pale, frightened faces. The sounds became more articulate as he crouched closer, whispers pleading, small hands clawing at the floor above, desperate for recognition, for rescue. He realized that any misstep could alert those who controlled this place, who had likely drilled fear into the children so thoroughly that even speaking could provoke punishment. The deputy also understood the larger implications. This was not a temporary situation. The cellar symbolized the depths of manipulation and control, the methodical way the patriarch maintained his twisted family structure, keeping multiple generations under surveillance and dominance. Every step into the house, every glimpse of the homestead's shadows, pointed to a system meticulously designed to isolate, subjugate, and perpetuate his doctrine. As he stared at the locked trapdoor, listening to the faint scratching beneath, he felt the suffocating weight of a legacy built on secrecy, obedience, and fear, and knew that whatever lay below could hold the key to the horrifying truth the town had whispered about for decades. The daughter-wife's secret plea came in the dead of night, when the forest around the homestead seemed to hold its breath and every sound was amplified against the thick darkness. The deputy had stationed himself at the edge of the clearing, heart pounding and ears straining for any hint of movement, when he noticed a shadow shifting among the trees. At first, he thought it was another trick of the moonlight, a swaying branch, or perhaps a deer venturing out in search of food. But then a soft, cautious voice called his name, trembling yet desperate, carrying a weight that made him freeze in place. She stepped out from the shadows, smaller than he had imagined, her eyes wide and glistening with fear. Dirt streaked her pale face, and her thin frame shook, but there was a strength in her gaze that immediately conveyed a plea for help he couldn't ignore. "Please," she whispered, barely audible over the rustle of leaves, "you have to take me away, before he comes." The words made the hairs on his arms rise, and a cold realization settled in that she had been living under the constant shadow of someone who had warped her understanding of family, love, and loyalty. She hesitated, glancing nervously over her shoulder, her eyes reflecting terror and mistrust simultaneously. The deputy noted the careful, almost rehearsed way she spoke, as if she had been trained to weigh every word, to give nothing away. Her tone carried both fear and urgency, a combination that told him this was not a child simply hiding from a parent but someone caught in a cycle of manipulation so extreme that escape seemed impossible without help. She revealed snippets of what life had been like inside the homestead, long, silent hours under the watchful gaze of the patriarch, the constant reinforcement of obedience and secrecy, and the terrifying rituals she had been forced to witness and participate in. Every story she told, every word she uttered, painted a portrait of a life stripped of choice, a childhood stolen, and a reality dominated by a man who had become both father and husband in her world, a truth so horrifying it seemed impossible to believe yet too real to ignore. The deputy realized the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. She confided that the patriarch had plans, ceremonies and arrangements that would perpetuate the cycle of control, rituals that were imminent and terrifyingly precise. Her voice trembled as she spoke, begging him not just to rescue her, but to intervene before more damage could be done, before the next generation of horror could be solidified. Each word she whispered carried the weight of unspeakable knowledge, of trauma accumulated over years of confinement and indoctrination, and he understood that her life, and perhaps the lives of others hidden within the forest, depended entirely on his next actions. In that silent night, surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the woods, the deputy grasped the magnitude of what he was facing. A living legacy of control and terror, embodied in the frightened girl who now stood before him, trusting him with the impossible task of dismantling it. As the deputy prepared to act on the girl's desperate plea, the woods themselves seemed to shift, closing in around him with a suffocating intensity. The air grew thick, damp, and heavy, carrying a tension that made each step feel measured and dangerous. Shadows stretched long and warped between the trees, twisting in ways that played tricks on the eyes, as if the forest were alive and aware of his intentions. A sudden crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the thicket made him freeze, heart hammering, and when he turned, he saw them emerging from the shadows. Figures moved silently, blending almost seamlessly with the darkened trunks, their presence deliberate and coordinated. They were not just random hunters or curious wanderers, they were armed, alert, and trained, their eyes glinting with an unnatural focus. Generations of the patriarch's kin had grown up hidden in these woods, trained to guard, protect, and perpetuate the secrets that had defined their isolated existence. Every movement was precise, practiced, a silent choreography of threat and vigilance, and the deputy understood instantly that he had stumbled into a web far more complex and dangerous than he had anticipated. The forest itself amplified the sense of menace. The thick canopy absorbed sound, creating an oppressive silence that made even the deputy's breathing seem loud, conspicuous, and vulnerable. The kin moved like shadows given form, appearing at unexpected angles, vanishing and reappearing without warning, as though the trees themselves were conspiring with them. Their familiarity with the terrain, the ease with which they navigated roots, hollows, and underbrush, marked them as native to this domain in a way he could not compete with. The deputy's every instinct screamed that escape would not be simple, that a misstep could mean capture, injury, or worse. Yet the girl's whispered warnings, the pleading in her eyes, and the knowledge of what awaited her if the patriarch's plans proceeded lent him resolve, forcing him to move despite the danger. As he attempted to maneuver through the undergrowth, the deputy began to notice subtle signs of the family's omnipresence. Small, camouflaged paths he had not seen before, crude traps meant to slow pursuers, and faint markers etched into tree bark that indicated routes known only to them. Their emergence was strategic, almost ritualistic, as if each appearance served to intimidate, test, and manipulate intruders, teaching them without words the rules of this secluded world. The deputy realized that confronting the patriarch's domain meant facing not only the man himself but an entire system of loyalty, fear, and control that had been meticulously cultivated over decades. The kin were extensions of his authority, embodiments of the inbred legacy, and their sudden appearance underscored the terrifying reality that this forest was not merely a hiding place, it was a fortress, alive with generations of protection, ready to defend the twisted hierarchy that had thrived beyond the reach of the outside world for decades. The final revelation came with a weight that pressed down on the deputy, a suffocating understanding that the horror he faced was far deeper and more calculated than he had ever imagined. Every clue he had uncovered, the abandoned trail, the hidden homestead, the journal filled with generations of meticulous records, the terrified girl who spoke of her father as both parent and husband, and the armed kin emerging from the shadows of the forest, now converged into a single, terrifying truth. The patriarch was not merely repeating cycles of abuse or isolation for convenience or madness, he was maintaining a bloodline that had been cultivated with obsessive precision over decades. Each generation had been molded, controlled, and manipulated not simply to survive, but to serve the patriarch's overarching vision of preserving the family's lineage in its most pure and insular form. The patriarch's long absence from the public eye, his presumed death, and his secret return all underscored the meticulousness with which he orchestrated the lives of his descendants, ensuring the cycle of fear, obedience, and secrecy continued uninterrupted. As the deputy pieced together the evidence, he realized the patriarch's control extended far beyond what he could see. The children hidden in the cellar, the girl who had pleaded for help, the armed relatives patrolling the woods all were components of a living, breathing system designed to enforce loyalty and maintain the patriarch's dominance. The journal entries spanning decades revealed an almost ritualistic dedication to this preservation, with detailed accounts of marriages within the family, roles assigned to each child, and punishments meted out to enforce compliance. This was not the work of a single tyrant acting on whimsy, it was a carefully constructed framework, a doctrine passed down through generations, that bound the family together in a network of fear, tradition, and isolation. The patriarch's influence had shaped not just behavior but perception, bending the family's understanding of morality, affection, and obligation until the unnatural felt normal, and the horrific felt inevitable. The deputy's understanding deepened further when he considered the implications for the town itself. For decades, the community had whispered about the family in hushed tones, avoiding the subject entirely yet sensing that something was profoundly wrong. Now it became clear that the patriarch's reach had not been limited to the forest, it had radiated outward, shaping perception, silencing inquiry, and ensuring that the hidden legacy remained intact. The family's isolation was not a natural result of rural life, it was an intentional, strategic containment designed to protect and perpetuate a horrifying lineage. The deputy grasped that what he was confronting was not just a criminal case or a missing person investigation. It was the living embodiment of a generational nightmare, a calculated system of control and manipulation that had survived for decades, nurtured in secrecy, and enforced with unwavering precision. The patriarch was not merely a man, he was the architect of a darkness that had quietly festered in the woods, a legacy that had become an institution unto itself, and the realization of its full scope left the deputy with a chilling awareness that the story he had uncovered was far larger, far older, and far more disturbing than he had ever imagined.